In 1966, the people of the small Victorian town of Japarat erected a memorial spire in honour of their most famous son. The plaque at its base tells us, "The spire symbolises the rise to world recognition of a boy who was born in Japarat and who rose by his own efforts to become Australian Prime Minister and a statesman recognised throughout the world." Like so many Australians of his generation, Menzies lived his life within the imaginative parameters of the British Empire and remains a strong empire figure in popular imagination.
In the year of my birth, 1894, Queen Victoria was on the throne of the United Kingdom and Ireland and the dominions and colonies beyond the seas. For us, the maps of the world were patterned with great areas of red, at the time when red was a respectable colour. It seemed to be a settled world, and on the whole, a good one. And of all the ancient landmarks that might be moved, the British Empire seemed to be the most unlikely.
Although only a mere dot on those red-patterned maps, far from the centre, Menzies' birthplace was firmly part of that empire. In 1894, Japarat was a pioneer town of about 200 white settlers on the Wimmera River in the northwest of Victoria, then still a colony. Menzies' parents, Kate and James, moved to this new wheat-growing region from Ballarat to set up a general store shortly before he was born. Robert was the fourth of their 5 children. His earliest memories include starting school, the empire-shaking death of Queen Victoria, and the great drought of 1902, when the whole area became a dust bowl. The family lived in a landscape where signs of prior Aboriginal occupation were obvious. The children played along the riverbank and saw the canoe trees from which Koori people had taken bark to make boats or food containers. Some Koori people still lived in the area, and just south of Japarat, on the road to Dimboola, was the Ebenezer Mission. Here, remnants of the tribes that once inhabited the area lived with missionaries from Moravia. The mission was closed in 1903. Also in Japarat during Menzies' childhood were German settlers who had come across the border from South Australia. This meant many of the people in the district spoke a foreign language. Menzies remembers going to the consecration of a Lutheran church and squirming through the incomprehensible German service. Yet none of this shook his or his family's conviction that Australia was British and that her future was as a member of the greatest empire the world had ever known.
Menzies was growing up in British settler society. His parents had been born in Ballarat, but their parents had come from the British Isles. And all of their sense of their purpose, their sense of their position on the globe, if you like, looked back to England. They were members of the British race, bringing civilisation, enlightenment and progress to a continent that, as far as they were concerned, had been inhabited by savages, by uncivilised people. And even although there were Germans living in the area, they were somehow excluded from the circle of light that was the British Empire, and which gave meaning to their existence.
Robert's brother Frank had been given the middle name Gladstone after the British Prime Minister, and his own second name, Gordon, was in honour of General Charles Gordon, the great military hero of the Empire, killed in the Sudan while defending the city of Khartoum against rebel natives in 1886. The young Menzies was a voracious reader. At home were well-read copies of Robbie Burns, Jane Porter's The Scottish Chiefs, and the novels of Jerome K. Jerome. And in the Japarat Mechanics Institute library, he found Deeds That Won the Empire, by the Melbourne schoolmaster W.H. Fitchard. First published as sketches in the Melbourne Argus during the 1890s, it told thrilling tales of the Empire's military heroes.
And on what a scale Great Britain, when aroused, can fight, let the Peninsular War tell. At its close, the fleets of Great Britain rode triumphant on every sea. This nation of shopkeepers proves that when kindled to action, it could wage war on a scale and in a fashion that might have moved the wonder of Alexander or of Caesar, and from motives, it may be added, too lofty for either Caesar or Alexander so much as to comprehend.
After some primary schooling in Japarat, Menzies was sent to school in Ballarat, his parents' birthplace. Ballarat was a proud imperial city, fiercely loyal to the empire and devoted to its monarch. It vied with all comers to be the most loyal city in the empire. When the Duke of York visited the city in 1901, a crowd of 50,000 turned out to see him lay the foundation stone for a Boer War monument. In Ballarat, Menzies first attended the Humphrey Street State School. While there, he won a scholarship allowing him to go to a private school. His scholastic ability was to win him many academic prizes and scholarships. In 1910, the family moved to Melbourne, where Menzies enrolled at Wesley College. The headmaster there was Dr. Lawrence Adamson, an upper-class Englishman of private means who instilled in his boys a fierce pride in empire and a reverence for all things British. During his school years, Menzies excelled in English literature and developed a particular love for English poetry that was to last all his life. While at Wesley, Menzies also became a keen follower of cricket, which was to be another great love of his life, particularly the regular test matches between member countries of the empire. Cartoonists were inevitably quick to draw on the connection between Menzies, cricket, and politics.
Now, cricket is a game so great, so splendid, so subtle, that as I contemplate the international scene, I realize more than ever that if we had only persuaded the Americans to play cricket, to have carried on the tradition of King of Philadelphia, and to have really got stuck into it, I think that might have solved a lot of problems.
Menzies continued his education at Melbourne University, where, amid its Gothic Revival architecture, copied from England, he studied for a degree in law. Again, he was immersed in British tradition. Australian law, particularly criminal law, is substantially derived from the ancient common law of England and the assumptions and practices on which it is built. British justice was seen as superior, and a legacy Australia shared with the other dominions. Menzies was still studying at university at the outbreak of World War I. He was a lieutenant in the University Rifles, doing compulsory military training which all boys between the ages of 12 and 18 had to do at that time. Another boy soldier in the University Rifles with Menzies was future Labour leader Arthur Corwell. During the war, Menzies wrote patriotic poems, such as one in memory of a Lieutenant Balfe, who was killed at Gallipoli.
His was the call that came from far away, an empire's message flashing o'er the sea, the call to arms. The blood of chivalry pulsed quicker in his veins. He could not stay.
Despite such expressions of imperial fervour, Menzies did not answer the patriotic call and enlist for overseas service himself.
When Menzies entered Victorian politics in the late 1920s. He was accused by ex-servicemen in particular who would come along to his meetings of having been a coward during the First World War for not having enlisted. And these accusations continue to dog him. It was a society in which many of the men of his age had fought in the war, so it was always a question mark over him, where were you? These accusations came to a head very much in 1939 when, after Lyons died, Menzies became a candidate for the leader of the United Australia Party. And Earl Page launched a very virulent attack on him in the House of Representatives, in which these accusations were raised again. Now, Menzies defended himself with a great deal of dignity. He said there were personal reasons in a man's life that he didn't feel he had to defend in public, and left it at that. His brother, in an interview I've listened to, said that essentially it was a family decision. Menzies was one of 5 children. He was the 4th child. His older 2 brothers were fighting, and that the family decided that he, Menzies, should stay. It was not out of the question that he mightn't have been called upon to support his parents, who were not particularly wealthy. And after that attack by Page, the issue essentially died.
After a brilliant law degree, Menzies was admitted to the Victorian Bar, where he quickly made a name for himself as a barrister, with his astute, analytical mind and powers of advocacy. Melbourne barristers, in the wig and black gown worn by British barristers since the time of Queen Anne's death in 1714, clustered around the Melbourne law courts, in a section of Little Collins Street known as Chancery Lane. Many of them lunched at the Savage Club, surrounded by native artefacts and trophies from Britain's coloured empire. When Menzies entered Victorian state politics in 1928 and federal politics 3 years later, he became a member of legislatures modelled on the Westminster tradition, with conventions and symbols derived from British parliamentary practice. Menzies' first visit to the country which was the source of the values and institutions which had shaped him did not happen until he was in his 40s. This was in 1935, by which time he was Federal Attorney General in Joseph Lyons' United Australia Party government. He went to England as a member of the Australian delegation attending King George V's Silver Jubilee. Sailing past the coast of Africa and through Aden, he wrote in his diary,
"Further reflections on the persistent Englishness of the English. Here is a golf course, there is a soccer football ground. The more I see of such people, the more satisfied I am that while doctrinaires and theorists speculate about self-government for the natives, the British calmly go on their way, giving to those people what obviously they could never give to themselves. Whatever may be said by pessimists in our country or at home, the men and women I have met in Ceylon, Aden and Egypt have given me no impression that the English are effete."
And when his ship finally reached its destination, he revelled in the sights and sounds of the centre of empire.
At last we are in England. Our journey to Mecca has ended, and our minds abandoned to those reflections which can so strangely, unless you remember our traditions and upbringing, move the souls of those who go home to a land they've never seen.
He also took pleasure in the peace and harmony of the English countryside, discovering the places he began reading of as a schoolboy in Japparat, and confirming his belief in England as the crucible of all that was of value in the modern world.
In 1935, Menzies made his first trip to England at the age of 41, and he was going there for a number of reasons. One was to conduct a case before the Privy Council. It was the Silver Jubilee, and so he was in the ministerial party, the King's Silver Jubilee, for the King's Silver Jubilee, and there was a meeting of the Empire Parliamentary Association too. He fairly rapidly acquired a reputation for being a good speaker. The crowning glory of the trip was the occasion when he actually spoke in Westminster Hall at a luncheon to the Empire Parliamentary Association, replying to the toast to the visitors that Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, moved.
Menzies listened carefully to the speeches of Britain's leading politicians.
Why should the whole world suddenly have got so much poorer? There has been peace. There has been no pestilence, no violent convulsion of nature. Bounteous harvests have rewarded the toil of man.
I hear Winston Churchill and discover that the idol has feet of clay. His language is good, but his expression hesitating, and he practically reads what he has to say.
Menzies was Prime Minister when World War II broke out in 1939.
Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of the persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war.
Menzies later defended Australia's automatic following of Britain into war.
Those were the days when the Commonwealth was a crown commonwealth, bound together by a common allegiance to a common crown. How could the king be at war and at peace at the same time in relation to Germany?
In 1940, Menzies went to Britain to represent Australia's war interests at the heart of empire.
There are basically three reasons why Menzies went to London. One was, of course, the obvious one, the one that he kept saying in the press, was to find out about Australia's defence position and the British reinforcement of Singapore. But I don't think that was the major reason. There were two other reasons. One was his political position, because he only had a majority of one, and the idea of an overseas trip, of course, is a tried and true method of boosting one's political support. And, of course, when he went overseas, he went to Singapore, saw the troops in Singapore, and did a lot of shaking of hands, etc. And similarly in the Middle East, he spent a lot of time going around and seeing every Australian soldier he could, and was most encouraged by the support he got. The third reason, of course, was he was worried about the war, worried about the direction in which Churchill was taking the British Empire, and fearful, in fact, that the British Empire would be lost by the way that Churchill was fighting the war. If you put yourself in Menzies' position, that was a very sensible position to take. There was no realistic way, balancing up the forces, of how Britain could defeat Germany in 1941. It was only after America came in that a victory, eventual victory, could be certain.
Menzies was deeply impressed by the courage of ordinary British people.
I address you as fellow citizens of the great British Empire, and it is my honor to speak to you from the center of that empire. If there is one thing that is clear to every British citizen living in any part of the British world, it is this. It is your fight, it is his, and he is yours.
Menzies used his home movie camera to record these scenes, as well as his meetings with the members of the British ruling elite.
The big surprise for Menzies once he got to London was finding that there were so many people who also thought that Churchill was a menace, that Churchill was leading Britain to defeat. People like Lloyd George, people in the military, people in the press, people like Lord Beaverbrook. Menzies spent 4 months in Britain trying to play out these indications of possible support for himself. And there were certainly powerful people who were indicating that Menzies had a chance of seeking a political career in Britain. In the context of the 1990s, it seems incredible that an Australian Prime Minister could aspire to Downing Street. But of course, in the 1940s, this was not so. I mean, Menzies saw himself as a Britisher. He talked of himself as being a Britisher first. There was no dividing line in his mind, and in the minds of many British people, between being British and being Australian. And there was a whole history, of course, of Australian politicians finding a political career in Britain. Menzies, because of his worries about the war, had to try and confront Churchill in some way. The tactic he chose was to try and push for an imperial war cabinet. And there was a lot of support within Britain for such a policy, and to some extent through the Empire. But crucially, of course, he made a tactical mistake in that neither Canada nor South Africa were prepared to support such a concept. So Menzies was forced to fall back on the idea of an imperial war cabinet with just an Australian representative. And of course this was never going to be a goer. But at the end of the day, I mean, this is the middle of the war, he couldn't spend as Australian Prime Minister more than 4 months in Britain and had to return to Australia to shore up his political position.
On the last evening of his flight back from England, as he crossed the Tasman Sea from New Zealand, Menzies wrote in his diary, "A sick feeling of apprehension comes upon me as I approach Australia. If only I could creep into the bosom of my family and rest there," or words to that effect. And these words have been quoted ad nauseam, out of context, by writers anxious to show that in some way or other Menzies disliked his own country. This interpretation, if you read the whole diary, is really quite absurd, because the diary is full of expressions of pride in the achievements of the Australian soldiers in North Africa, pride in the country generally. Australia is ace high, is one of the things he said. He was depressed because he was very, very tired. It had been a very strenuous 5 months. He knew he was coming home to an unstable political situation with almost evenly balanced parties.
I come back to Australia with just one sick feeling in my heart, and that is that I must now come back to my own country and play politics. I think that it's a diabolical thing that anybody should have to come back and play politics, however cleanly, however friendlily, at a time like this.
Within months of returning to Australia, Menzies resigned as Prime Minister. He spent most of the 1940s rebuilding his political career, rethinking his political values, and coming to terms with a political future limited by the intractable fact of his Australianness.
Ambitious Australians always have a problematic relationship with England, particularly, up until I think the generation of the 70s. And I don't think Menzies is any exception here. He's always been seen as being someone who just simply adores England. But I think the story's more complicated. He does adore England in a sense, but also in adoring England, it means that his Australianness is somehow downvalued. It seems to me that there is an ambivalence in Menzies' relationship with England, which isn't very often seen. When he went over on his first trip in 1935, and he's talking to various members of the English ruling class, he says, "I want you to realise that when I come here, this is my England, my Hastings, my Westminster Abbey." He wants to remind the English on the Australians' claim to England, but in doing that he recognises that the English don't quite see the Australians in the way the Australians would like the English to see them. And I think Menzies felt that as much as Australians like Henry Lawson, or Australians who've seen themselves as more nationalist. He just dealt with it differently. He dealt with it by idealising England, making it into a centre, and then seeing it as his task to keep reminding England of how loyal Australians were to it and how important they were to it.
He made another trip to England in 1948. England was by then in the hands of the socialists, who, Menzies feared, were sorely lacking in empire imagination. On the ship over, he wrote a manuscript called Not to Yield, in which he argued that the British Empire was as relevant in the post-war world as it had ever been.
Our curse today is the smallness of our thought. The devil take those Lilliputians who, in Australia or elsewhere, want to persuade us that utter independence of policy and action is of the essence of Australianness, and who in Great Britain appear never to have absorbed even a hint of the stimulating truth. But the boundaries of Great Britain are not on the Kentish coast, but at Cape York and in the Cargill. What does the British Empire mean? To me, it means, and here you will find a curious jumble in both time and place, a cottage in the wheatlands of the northwest of the state of Victoria, with the Bible and Henry Drummond and Jerome K. Jerome and the Scottish chiefs and Burns on the shelves. It means the long sweep of the Wye Valley above Tinton, with a Wordsworth in my pocket, looking north across the dim Northumbrian moors from the Roman wall, with the rowan trees on the slopes before me and 2,000 years of history behind.
I think that's a very interesting passage because it's written in 1948 when the British Empire is still there. And when a couple of years later Menzies publishes that, he changes the question, what does the British Empire mean to me, to what does the British Commonwealth mean to me? And essentially he just transfers the whole emotional and psychological structure of empire that has been what's given his life meaning and shape and purpose onto the Commonwealth. And it shows the way in which Menzies, in a sense, desperately wanted the Commonwealth to carry the same sorts of meanings that the Empire had carried.
In 1949, the newly formed Liberal Party won the federal election, and Menzies was again Prime Minister, beginning his unbroken 16 years of power. As Australian Prime Minister, Menzies regularly attended the Commonwealth Prime Ministers' conferences. But the new Commonwealth was very different from the old Empire. The pre-war Empire of Great Britain and the white settler societies of Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa was united by blood and by a shared allegiance to the Crown.
I always think about these conferences in London between British Commonwealth countries as family conferences. If we all keep thinking of it in that way, we'll do very well.
The post-war Commonwealth of Nations shared a historic connection with the British Empire, but now many were not monarchies, and most were not white. India, once the jewel in the imperial crown, had finally won self-government in 1947. It became a republic, with a president as head of state, though it remained a member of the British Commonwealth. Other states followed as the colonized people of the British Empire gained self-rule. Menzies viewed the changes with resigned sadness. The empire which gave unity to the world of his youth had passed. England, the monarchy, and Britain's proud imperial history continued to be a source of pleasure and meaning for Menzies. In the 1960s, the sustaining myth of his life, that Australians were Britons in another part of the world, reached its fulfillment in his knighthood and subsequent appointment to the ancient offices of Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports and Constable of Dover Castle, offices once held by some of the men he had read about as a boy in Japarat.
The appointment of myself to this office is the first appointment of a man from outside the UK, and most certainly the first appointment of a man from the outer Commonwealth, as I may perhaps describe it. I cannot pretend for one moment that I am as fit for this high office as the Churchills or Wellingtons or Pitts. That would be ridiculous. But after all, a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for?